Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's section. It's brilliant, actually, to see a lot of people from last week and then a couple of new faces, so that's encouraging. Um, I was happy with last week's section, especially that it's brought out some conversations, even though some of it might be uncomfortable. It was good to see that openness to engage with it. So I'm hoping tonight's section also will be going in that same direction. So today's topic is on diversity in leadership. And Clive, who is here, is going to lead us on that. Clive is someone that, yes, I've known within the community, involved with a lot of racial justice, someone that is actually very prominent within the Black community. So Clive is a minister with the Pilgrim Church Charitable Trust, and he's been leading the Pilgrim Church response to Windrush scandal, also advising the Home Office and the UK government on their responses to the crisis. He's also a trustee for Citizens, another organization that a lot of us here I know work with. So Clive, you're welcome to our midst. Clive will be covering the importance of encourage a discipleship pipeline. So like we said, today is diversity in leadership. So before I go on, I was just looking at the opening prayers, and I came across the Archbishop's Anti-Racism Task Force, the prayer they released ahead of the racial justice. And I love the wordings of those prayers. So I'm going to read through that, and let's let those words wash over us and let it mean something to us. So let us pray. Love incarnate, fountain of mercy and justice. In a world of inequity and pain, may our actions be our prayer. We cry out for shalom, fullness of life to all. Let the spirit of truth guide us. Let the spirit of love free us. Give us the compassion, courage, and resolve to become the light we seek. We seek that many may see life and their dignity restored. Inspire us to embody a world without injustice and prejudice. Form us into channels of your love and peace. Let the river of justice and mercy flood our imperfect world, quenching the thirst of parched souls and land. Abide in us, O Liberator, that we may become the word so that the world may have life and life in all its abundance. Amen. So over to you, Clive. Sarah, we're going to handle all the technicals.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Edith, for that very kind welcome. And good evening to everyone. And thank you for joining this workshop, looking at diversity in leadership. And as Edith was saying, I'm going to be sharing with you via a PowerPoint some of the aims and objectives of today's workshop. I really want to make this workshop a learning experience, so please do feel free to put things in the chat or ask questions as well. It might be difficult for me to see the chat sometimes if we got a full PowerPoint on, as it were. But do feel free. I think it's okay just to, if you want to ask a question, make a point, because I want you to see this as a learning experience where you can engage and interact as well. So I'm really happy for that to happen. Don't feel offended that you're interrupting. You know, I'm just doing one slide after the next, as it were, because this is about how we learn together, as it were. There is going to be a break, so we're going to go through one session. There is, I think, programmed to be a a breakout room where we're going to ask a few questions and then come back and then sort of get the feedback from that. And then we'll go into a bit of a break and then come back into the final session. I think the session is scheduled for 2 hours. We may be a bit quicker than that, I'm not sure. But let's see how we go on. I mean, first of all, I want to say that I feel very blessed to be a person. Edith mentioned that I've been doing stuff with regards to the Windrush response. And my parents were from Jamaica. I'm one of 5 siblings. I was born in Birmingham, lived all my life in Nottingham. I feel very blessed and privileged that I, through divine providence, got into a church where there was leadership, and there was leadership that was diverse in that it was male and female leadership, that was Black leadership. And something for me as a youngster, as a young Black male growing up, that was very, I now look back and see how important and how formative and how influential that was, tremendously so. So I don't come to this as a person who has read a few books or just got a bit of passion, but it is coming from a deep experience of understanding and recognizing the challenges and the difficulty and the successes of being involved in leadership, and coming to it from a Black perspective and from a church dimension, which I think are quite unique, but not unusual. And it's some of this which I hope to bring to be sharing with you. Some of the things you may have heard already, some of the things may just have a different spin. But I hope that we can sort of come together and experience this. And I don't mind if you go through this session and you want to explain your position, because I don't know everybody on here in terms of what your situation is, as it were, with regards to leadership and the people that you're leading as such. So, you know, if you want to make a comment, please don't be afraid to say, and I'm involved in this and so forth, because that can potentially help shape the dimensions of how we take this forward. So I'm going to share my screen and take us to a PowerPoint, but does that sound like a plan with everybody? Yep, okay. So I'm going to share my screen into a PowerPoint, and there we go. I'm going to go full screen. Okay, so if probably Sarah or Edith give me a thumbs up, everybody can see that. Yeah, thank you. Okay, so I'm going to be looking at leadership, diversity in leadership, from representation, role modeling, and developing a leadership pipeline. So what's the aim of today? So today we want to explore the importance of representation, insights to increase representation, role modeling, and encourage a leadership pipeline. First of all, I want to say, I think we can all agree that there is different types of characteristics that make up representation. I will be focusing more so on the racial kind of a background, but where we can apply other characteristics, you know, please feel free to sort of say so and challenge that. But I'm looking this mainly from the kind of racial side and the Black experience as well. So that's the aim of this session. Just to say as well, I can make these this PowerPoint slide available should you want that as well. And I have just earlier sent in a bit of an action plan in which Sarah's going to put in the chat, which you can use to hopefully help you create your own responses and actions taking this forward. So the objectives are, going through today, I'd hope that we can start to, again, just recognize that Christian leadership was always diverse. Dispel the myths of a one-dimensional type of leadership. We can look at obtaining strategies to assess and deliver improved diversity in leadership, and to develop an ongoing action plan to address leadership diversity in the area that you're experiencing. So why is leadership important? I want to say, as I mentioned earlier, I'm from the Pilgrim Church, and my leadership experience came very much from the leadership of a gentleman by the name of Revd Canon Christian Weaver. Some of you may be aware of him. He's a JP, originally from Antigua, came over with his family in the late 60s, came to Leicester and came over to Nottingham, had a calling on his life to develop a church. And from that was birthed what was known as the Pilgrim Church. It was part of a wider denomination at the time, connected to the Methodist Church and the John Wesley tradition. And during those stages, he was very visionary in his approach to leadership, very inclusive, and had a great insight for actually allowing young people to come and get involved in leadership at the highest level. And that was a challenge for people who were there a long time. But he took great courage in, as it were, chucking people in the deep end. But it was his foresight and working with a colleague, a female colleague by the name of Reverend Rose Burrell. And I was able to work as part of a team with them, work closely with them, just being next to them to see leadership development. So why is leadership important? Well, I would just suggest a few things here. And these quotes are taken from one of my pioneer mentors online, a gentleman by the name of Miles Monroe. Some of you may be familiar with him. Miles Monroe is was, I should say, he sadly passed away, was a Barbadian teacher, minister, who's done a lot of work on leadership and purpose. I would recommend looking at some of his material if you're interested in that. Why is leadership important? And he said these quotes: "Nothing changes without leadership. Nothing improves without leadership, and nothing is successful without leadership." And so one of the things that we do know in society more prevalently is that where there is good leadership, we get good results. And what we recognize is that there is a increasing need for diversity in leadership to give a better and higher level of quality of results. Now, why are we here? I would say that we are here, and challenge me if you don't think this is the case, but I would say that a lot of us are here as a result of what happened to George Floyd to some degree. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, yeah.
Absolutely. Isn't when we just step back and think about that, that's quite amazing in itself. So it's our reaction to the action that happened in the United States to a black man by a police officer, and he was murdered, and it was recorded. And now we're faced with the reaction to discrimination on such a global scale, on such a wide scale, in terms of particularly institutions. And we have seen the kind of a surge of the Black Lives Matter, but George Floyd, that happened in America. He wasn't the first black man to be suffer at the hands of the police. And we know even in our own country, you see there, I've got a picture of Stephen Lawrence, the young teenager who was sadly murdered in 1993, stabbed to death. And, you know, there was a subsequent McPherson's report that described the police as institutional racist. And then other organizations got pulled into this. And I know even the Church of England has gone through its as it were, challenge and questioning around institutional racism. And look, we know there's a picture there of Dr. Martin Luther King, the civil rights leader, and so much that he stood for and pioneered with regards to getting equality. And isn't it very interesting that King came from the church tradition to actually sort of lead that. And when you look at actually the civil rights, without going too much into it, but the history of that was very much around also diverse leadership. King was able to call upon and got support from the Jewish community. There were some more liberal wings of the church that were involved as well. And also there were people who and not a lot of people sort of recognize this, who were white, who lost their lives, young people in that struggle for racial equality. Yeah. So there's a reaction to the action, and perhaps one of the learnings that we need to take out of this in terms of understanding diversity in leadership from a church perspective is how are we making it more of a norm rather than just a reaction from an incident, that we raise, as it were, our gaze and our game to address this issue. So I think that's one of the first challenges that I would put to us. You know, how are we actually addressing issues of what is the diverse makeup of our own leadership? How are we getting the best out of our areas, as it were? You know, there's an interesting quote that Jesus says that, you know, if the blind leads the blind, they will both end up in the ditch. And so one of the most important things about leadership I mentioned is that it's important to know, where is this leadership taking you? Where is the leadership going? How can leadership empower, develop your environment? Because if you find yourself to be a leader and you do not know where you're going, then that is a high responsibility that you're investing in. And so we're going to look at the importance of actual having the vision with regards to leadership. So diversity of leadership, why is it important? One of the things that we, as I mentioned earlier, that we've become increasingly aware of is that we can gain a greater quality of decisions and hence outcomes when there is more diverse perspectives in a decision-making process. This is vital. You just think about from an organization and institutional point of view, from a church point of view, and where you need to be making decisions. And you know, we make decisions based on the information that is around us, available to us from our experiences, from intuition, from knowledge. But increasingly, we are seeing and we know that different perspectives can bring a greater quality and outcome with regards to decisions. So this is why diversity of leadership is so important for our churches and for the way that we want to make certain decisions that it's affecting any aspect of church involvement. So diversity of leadership is about having another, I should say, perspective rather than respective than your own. There's a phrase that I've seen used, my way or the highway. And sometimes, you know, that can lead to people feeling that they are not part of a decision-making process, which then leaves people out in the cold and then leaves people to be disengaged. And then after a long period of time, leaders think, well, why aren't people getting involved and talking or whatever? It's because they didn't feel a sense of being involved in any kind of leadership. And there's different type and involvement in the decision. And we're not just talking, and I would like to suggest that we're not just talking about a one-time consultation and fill in this survey, but how is it, and it goes back to the very early points I was making, how are we embedding the type of diverse leadership? And let's use a little bit of a play on words here. We talk about systematic or systemic racism, but how about systemic diverse leadership development? And how are we approaching that? How are we looking to make that the norm rather than the exception? knowing that we get clear outcomes and benefits, greater quality of outcomes in our decisions as well. It's also about having a fairer representation in the decision-making process. And there's something about it, it creates an attractive and inclusive community when there is the sense of, I can see myself in that. One of the biggest aspects of why diversity of leadership is important is because when that diversity is there and it's present, you can potentially see yourself. I always remember when I was part of an organization and they had it was like a general meeting to elect people to be part of the leadership team. And they'd made the decision to select a number of people. And the organization was saying, you know, we're going forward with certain things to do with justice. And there wasn't no one of color represented. And it actually took a senior minister, a friend of mine, to say, no, this can't be right. We need to challenge that, because if we're saying we're going to be representing diversity, then diversity needs to be a part of the leadership and the decision-making process. So and that is that was a bold statement to make in that context. But it's about the quality of outcomes that we're getting with regards to the work of the church. So diversity is about gaining greater outcomes, having your own perspective challenged as well, and making a fairer representation and creating an attractive and inclusive community. So look, you know, we can't talk about diversity without looking at the ideology that we call of racism and what has caused within the church dynamic, and this is what we're focusing on here this evening, the impact of slavery and colonialism on the church. There's a whole history of that. I don't need to go into this, but for this session, I think it's really important. And I know Edith talked about you had some honest conversations about this already. It's really important that we understand where we're coming from with regards to why is there not this diversity of leadership, which is not just reflected in the church, but also across society. You know, there's been and it's been the impact of from slavery and colonialism on the church. There was a false narrative of Black people being inferior. There's an interesting book called it's actually called the ideology of racism by someone by the name of Samuel Yeboah. And Samuel Yeboah talks about how there was an actual doctrine of people being inferior. That's interesting to note, because that was like perpetuated. And so if you're perpetuating inferiority, you're elevating superiority in one race. And so it was this notion which was inherent, was being propagated as a result of slavery. That kind of, as it were, thinking ideology led to certain practices and social, what we call, it created social practice. And those practices were seen in terms of political, economic, and just social. And we know that slavery was purely a social construct, an economic construct. And it was this, it's this kind of a legacy that we're dealing with when we look at the history of the effects of racism and colonialism in the church. So the effects of this history and the effects of empire, it was this kind of a cruel act of slavery that kind of had to be backed up and reconciled. And the church, even at the time, had to do this as well. And the church was complicit because there were church leaders in the 16th and 17th century who were slave trade owners, and the status of the slaves were like, okay, you are free from sin and salvation has given you free from sin and you're in Christ, but you're still treated as a slave, as it were. And it's important that we recognize the history and the context for the sake of that it was economic development of the empire, and particularly in the West Indies, which we know were the produce of like sugar and tobacco and cotton via the what was known as the Golden Triangle slave trade. And it was this history is what we're breaking free from is this kind of a colonial relationships and behaviors that's affected black and white. So it's important to sort of recognize this from that real experience and dimension as to what we are dealing with in terms of why is it that within society, even within our churches, there is a lack of diversity, particularly from the black community in leadership. And the ideology was could only be justified as if black people were subhuman. They weren't human. So, and a result of that thinking, we could treat them differently as slaves. So let's bring it back again round then in terms of, let me just put out a few questions here. Then I just want you to sort of just reflect on them. So, and if anybody wants to comment on that, they can do. So what do you really think about diversity in leadership? What's your own thinking about it? And what are some of the thoughts that become a barrier to diversity? So, I mean, with those two first questions, I just wondered if there's any responses. What do you really think about diversity in leadership? Anyone would want to comment?
Clive, for the first question, what do you really think about diversity in leadership? For myself, over the years, if I see myself in leadership, I feel I belong and I can make a contribution, I can aspire, I can become like my peers. If I never see myself, I feel subservient. I think I can only do what I'm told to do. I can never fulfill ambitions that I might have.
Thank you, Denzel, for that really helpful insight. Thank you. Anyone else? Let's be open here, because some of us may come from a position. Well, actually,
Clive.
Yes.
Yeah, a little thought on that too. Sorry. I was reflecting on leadership also, even from the back of our discussion last week, and diversity in leadership. I was just seeing it as just much more than numbers or seeing people there, because I think it's shifting like almost, okay, there is somebody of color, but is that a position with authority, or is it just that's a nominal position? Does that leadership influence policy? Does it contribute? Does it make a difference? Or is it just also the other person making themselves also feeling good that, okay, there is this, last week he was talking about still having that colonial mentality. It's almost like something you're giving. So it's still that kind of imbalanced relationship. So I think diversity would mean proper diversity, equity in representation, that's you have both position and authority, and that you can influence policy.
I think the point you make about authority is so important. And you're hinting towards something that we're going to touch upon a bit later, which is tokenism. And it's about diversity which is authentic, which says yes and which says no, and which is accepted. So I think you're hitting on some real key areas there. Anyone else before we move on? So a couple of the other areas I'm thinking about in this one is what does it take to break poor thought habits? Because we're talking about diversity of thought here. And I think that was a phrase that was used by some politician. I can't remember exactly who it was. In fact, I think it was the former health secretary, if I remember rightly. And we can think that through having diversity of, we may think, well, we're very open, we're very kind of open to ideas and from other perspectives. But as I said earlier, I mean, look what was earth-shaking that happened to George Floyd that really started a conversation. I was very much involved in having a number of conversations with ministers, black and white, after that. Some of you may have got the book. I mean, I've got it here. I don't know if you can see my screen still, I'm not sure, but it's Why I'm No Longer Talking to White People About Race.
Yes.
And I think everybody was reading that, wasn't it?
Yeah.
And I know a lot of people were challenged by that book. But it was about this kind of a conversation. And you know what? For some people, it was the first time they were having this type of conversation.
Yeah.
I'm talking about, we're talking about 2020, the first time having this conversation in a church where we all love God, where we all praise together, where we all lift up our hands together, and we all, and it was the first time that people were saying, well, I didn't know you felt like this. I didn't know that's what was your lived experience. And so that was because our thinking was at a level whereby that was where the level of our thought was. It was as if the George Floyd event raised another level of consciousness and gave a little bit of an opening for expression. And that was what we would call a deep challenge to our thoughts around inclusivity. And as a result of that, it leads to leadership, because if you're not included, what is it? What is that? Well, what is your influence? Because one definition of leadership will be talked about as influence. And you just imagine if you're leading a congregation and you have people, for whatever reason, feel that they're powerless. If you think about it, it is the opposite to what Christ says that we should be, because Christ says that you will be empowered. And people, it was we recognize that there was a powerlessness that was being shown, and there was what was a perceived power by the majority group as well. So how are we thinking about leadership is going to really be important, determining where we're going forward. So it's not just our thoughts that we get challenged, but I really believe in that we've got to go beyond thoughts and just books when it comes to inclusion and diversity. And the challenge is how are we going to engage with people who are not like us? How are you going to engage with people who are not like you? And this is about, I think, building confidence and recognizing that it's within your gift, it's within our gift to actually embrace other people who are different, who can bring something valuable to the leadership that we are all involved in, that you are involved in. So this question is, what is the level of your engagement with persons of a global heritage in your church right now? I mean, I just want you to reflect on that, because we're going to go out into a breakout room with some other questions. And here's an interesting one. When was the last time where when you felt you were in a minority, and what did it feel like? Does anybody want to share when they last felt they was in a minority? Great. Well, it seems like no one has ever felt like that.
I'll share.
Go for that.
3 years ago,
3 years ago today, actually, I was at a conference in South Africa. We went on a curate training for 2 weeks to experience life and the church in South Africa. And actually that was a real significant time for me. It changed a lot of my thinking and I guess my consciousness about race particularly. And what was really interesting about this conference is actually most of the people at the front were white, but the majority of people actually in the conference were black, and there was this kind of uprising that kept happening where they just, the black people in the congregation would just sing and kind of outdo the white people at the front. And we break out into workshops and things, but actually as a white person, even in the queues for the toilets and things, I was looking around and thinking, wow, this is the first time that I've felt in the minority as a white person. And actually, I was embarrassed to be a white person in that context, and very much wished at that moment that I was not white, because of the depth of feeling that there was and the lack of trust and everything towards white people. So yeah, that was a real interesting experience.
Thank you very much for sharing that, Lydia. And I think that's very interesting in terms of how it made you feel emotionally and psychologically, and what was at play there as well, with regard to that. I don't know if there was anyone else who wanted to mention anything about that, an experience.
Yeah. So I've gone, Paul.
Yeah, I used to live in Japan for a little while. It's a very monoculture, and I felt I had to be on my best behavior because I was the object of scrutiny and attention. And it's sometimes difficult when you're the object of scrutiny and attention because you don't feel terribly comfortable. And so it was a good time, a very good time indeed, but I was on my best behavior. Yeah,
that's interesting. Thank you for sharing that, Paul. The pressure of having to live up to a stereotype, if for want of a word. Sorry, someone else was coming in as well.
It was me, Clive. Sorry, it's Liam.
Yeah, go on, Liam.
It just, Lydia just speaking like that, and earlier today, actually, bizarrely, I had a conversation with somebody that reminded me of, it's about 1994, I was in South Africa in one of the townships just after the election, and I remember being in church, and it was really amusing because I was pointed out to be, in Zulu, the whitest man in Africa, but they called me a ghost. and they're illustrating the point that the point of the sermon and the preacher I knew was around the fact that we are a diverse nation, and here we've got 2 white people in our congregation now. That can't be right, which was quite an interesting spin on another way of looking at it, because I don't know about you, Lydia, or Paul perhaps, or anybody else. I don't know who's felt like they've been in a minority in the UK. I must admit, I feel like a minority one amongst clergy because I feel like the odd one out. But that's for another conversation. But yeah.
Yeah, it's a very interesting one, because it's how you react, I guess, in that situation, wherever you are in the world. But it's interesting from these conversations. But for many Black people, that is very much a almost ongoing lived experience. And it's like,
Chris,
well,
I think Chris wanted to say something.
Sorry, yeah, I can't see hands and everything because I'm sharing. So just jump in, ladies and gentlemen.
Thank you. My name's Chris. I'm a lay stipendial minister. I'm the only one left in the diocese. And often I attend things with lots of clergy there. And I feel quite, because I'm not ordained, I feel very different. Even though I shouldn't, but I feel it makes me, I used to feel extremely insecure. And I still, when I go to things, I feel a little bit insecure because I'm different, because I'm not ordained.
Thank you very much for sharing that, Chris. And again, it's those powerful feelings that can result in the way that we perform because of those perceptions. And we want to come on to recognizing one of the insights of this learning I'm hoping to share with you is something I call intelligent observation, which is about sort of as it were, how can we, sorry to just use you, Chris, but how could we spot a Chris Easton as a leader? How could we spot someone who is capable, but there is this shadow of maybe feeling not good enough, and there is some kind of a thinking we need to be doing around that as leaders. Okay, so do we all know who this is?
Yeah.
So we're going into some Old Testament leadership now, and here's Moses, or should we say Charlton Heston, and the great portrayal of the Ten Commandments. So Moses was a leader, we know that, was a chosen leader by God. Just to emphasize again, I'll spend hopefully about a few minutes, and then we just go into a little bit of a quick breakout and then a break. The Bible is a multicultural book. And when Moses was actually a child, as we know, he was taken up by the Egyptians, and he was brought up through that kind of Egyptian tradition. Moses went through, as we know, a recognition and self-discovery of his heritage, as from the Hebrews, as it were. And we know that he took it upon himself to become a leader. And he decided that he saw one of his brethren who was being mistreated, and he used his own particular type of leadership to intervene and effectively kill somebody. Then he spent years in the wilderness, and we know that he was divinely chosen by God in his encounter with the burning bush. But Moses had personal weaknesses, and he had inadequacies, but yet he was still chosen to lead. And he had challenges with people, even to the point when he received the 10 Commandments. We know that he was so upset with the way people were that he threw them down. And there were times when he did things which God had to challenge him on. Denzel, yeah, I've got your hand. You got your hand raised.
I don't think it was meant to be. My computer crashed and I'm on my iPad. Which I'm
okay, no worries.
Yeah, apologies.
No worries. So we see that Moses went through a bit of a transformation in leadership. Now that's just an image, isn't it, of Moses the leader? And I'm talking about this in the context of Old Testament leadership, and someone who God used. And even Moses, when he was called, says, I don't feel adequate to do this leadership role. And God says, well, I'm going to give you Aaron, who's going to, as it were, support you in that and do certain things that you feel you can't do. So when we're talking about diverse leadership, and especially coming from the church, we just, we can't have the attitude, well, I can't see it being done, or it's too difficult. Where there's a will, there's a way. But the point I want to make with this is that I don't know if Moses looked like Charlton Heston, but I do know that he was married to an Ethiopian, and I do know that Ethiopians look like this lady here. And Moses actually was defending these people. That's how we got involved with the Ethiopian lady. And the story, as we know, that it was at the well, and there was people who were interacting with them, who came to interact with them, and Moses came and defended them because he was accepting of others. And he married an Ethiopian woman. And it's very interesting that even in the scriptures from the Old Testament, his own family wasn't accepting of him. Think about this: he's now a leader, and he's in what you can call a multicultural relationship, diverse relationship. And that became an issue, even with members of his family. And God had to sort of take action on that. But I'm making the point that the multicultural nature of leadership and the effects of that this is not something that is new or as a result of, you know, all the history that was some of it that we've talked about already. But these are real challenges that people from time have had problems with, and it's and this is where I'm talking about here. How are we accepting of people and others who are different from us, and even who may not have a direct responsibility in terms of leadership, but it could influence our thoughts and our reactions, as it were, to how we lead. And we say that now, and that is because I want us to become aware that there is lots of knowledge out there now about understanding the Black presence in the Bible, and just about helping us in terms of diversity. That picture you can see here is of Simon of Cyrene. It was actually painted by Reverend Canon Christian Weaver, my leader and mentor, and he was an artist. And the story behind that, he says that when he was growing up, he says he never really, and I think one of our colleagues here mentioned about seeing oneself. I don't know if it was Francis or Denzel, I couldn't see the face at the time, but talked about seeing yourself. And Reverend Canon Christian Weaver was saying, he says he read the Bible, he grew up, you know, Anglican taught, as it were, and he says he never really saw himself. And it wasn't until he became aware later in his years, as a young man, that there was the presence of Black people. When you think of some of the images of Christianity, it's very Michelangelo, isn't it? And those images have a striking impact on us, whether they're, you know, in our churches. I don't know. You go into some churches and all the saints and everything, and it's an image where it is of one culture, and people can't see themselves. And so it was through understanding this that Reverend Canon Christian Weaver embraced the idea of seeing his own identity. And that doesn't mean that someone else is not valued. It just means I can see myself, as it were. And there are just some quotes there of some other people from Africa who quote about their, as it were, their Blackness in the Bible as well. So I talked about this very briefly. I talked about the power of intelligent observation. If we're talking about diversity, know the state of your flock. Who is it in your environment that you could be engaging with that could be pulled into an area of leadership and development? And one of the things I noticed in the Old Testament is that God would often say to prophets and to leaders, or maybe to prophets, what is it that you see? It's a very interesting question. And that was all that he would say. What is it? Say, well, I see a melting pot, or I see, well, says, okay then. And then from that, it was built up a whole strategy. But first of all, what is it that you see? And what is it that you see that is present? And what is it that you see that is absent? And that is another dimension. But and I think sometimes in terms of understanding the importance of diverse leadership, it's about how we view things. Because I go back to like the George Floyd. I think there was a consciousness raised because there was an awareness of, well, we're not seeing certain things here. We are seeing certain things here. And so being aware of your own landscape is really important, and taking the time to observe that and reflect on that. And can you envision diverse transformation in your church? What would be the picture of a transformed diverse leadership, what would that look like for you? Could you see that? Could you believe that? Okay, you might not even see the people now, but could you envision that? I'm in a majority Black-led church. Could that be all white or all Asian? Could, you know, what is the transformation that you could envision or for diverse? How diverse can it get? And so, and being observant as to where we're at is so important. So I want to take us out into a breakout session for about, you know, about 10 minutes. And I'd like to pose these questions to you for that breakout session. And do you have a clear sense of what is, and I use this term wrong, I should put it in brackets, but is there diversity? And to what extent is it? So I'd like you to share how diverse is your own leadership. Why is your leadership, why do you think the leadership is the way it is in terms of diversity? And what could you do to increase the diversity? And share when you've experienced the benefits of diverse leadership. So if we can just make a note of that, and if we can perhaps go out into breakout rooms, so those questions, and then if we come back in 10 minutes.
Ready when you are. Opening the rooms now.
How diverse is your leadership? Why is your leadership the way it is? What could you do to include it? Diversity. Share your experience of diverse leadership. now Denzel's there, I think we can all get cracking. So I just want to give an opportunity for those of you in that session. If anyone would just like to, you know, just briefly have a few comments in terms of what you were sharing, any insights or thoughts from that breakout session about how diverse your church, your leadership is, and any thoughts of increasing.
Yes, Clive, I was reflecting on my church and how diverse we are, and I've been so for quite some time. And I was reflecting back in my own younger days when an elderly Christian person befriended me, and I would say mentored me and helped me to get involved with leadership from a youth dimension, you know, to PCC, to, you know, getting licensed as a reader. So what I was saying is that it's not just the vicar's responsibility to look to get diversity in a church. It's the membership. It's the senior members, white, Black members in a church, seeing potential and trying to help somebody, the person, to become a leader.
Wow, fantastic point. I'm really loving that point in terms of something which I believe is very much a New Testament dimension, is that everyone's a leader. Everyone has a specific particular role to play, and you know, you're bringing it out in terms of how you were introduced, as it were, to leadership and mentorship, which are some of the key skills for leadership development. And you're so right about potential. And this is what's blighting a lack of diversity of leadership. We're actually blocking potential. Because Denzel, if you didn't get the opportunity, if someone didn't take you under their wing,
I wouldn't be who I am.
Yeah, absolutely. And I would say the same for my own life with regards to leadership development. Someone said, here's an opportunity, here's a chance, stick by me and go and give that a go. Anyone else who wants to just reflect on anything that came out of that breakout experience? So what I'm going to do, if there is none, I'm going to quickly take you through the last phase of this presentation, and then we can have a chance for any kind of feedback. So I'm just going to return back to sharing screen. Actually, some of the things that was said by Denzel, we're going to be picking up as part of this next final session now. So if probably Sharon, Sarah, or Edith give me a thumbs up that everyone can see the screen.
Yeah.
Yeah. Diverse leadership requires courage. Using Denzel's point, it's going to require some courage to understand the importance or to see the value of and breaking barriers for engaging in diverse leadership. So one of the things I'd like to suggest here is just some assumptions. Don't assume. Don't assume that someone will be good at singing or leading worship because, you know, we may think that's what they're good at. That may be great, but don't just pigeonhole people on the expectations of this is what a person will be good at and this is what I expect a person not to be good at. I remember at school, you know, the PE teacher, you know, thought, yeah, Clive would be a good 200 meters runner or 400 meters runner. Honestly, I was terrible. I was terrible at 400. I couldn't run a lap to save my life. But I love playing tennis. And tennis was very much back then, and it was seen, this was pre the Williams sisters, you know, tennis was saying, well, actually, that's for a kind of class of people, tennis, Clive. And so please don't assume. So these are some don't assumptions. Don't assume that someone will put themselves forward with their gift. I go back to Denzel's point. Denzel could do something. He already had it within him, but someone else had to take him. And so because someone may have a gift, and sometimes what I have realized is that the church can be the most safest and best place for people to develop their gifts, but sometimes it can become a place where gifts are not developed and people are stifled. And so don't assume that a person will come forward with their gift. You may have to do some fact finding. You may have to find out what else is there about this person. And you may be surprised to understand what people can do, what backgrounds they've had. And lots of people are coming to churches now, and they've got tremendous diverse backgrounds. Ask, as we all know that phrase, ask and it shall be given unto you. Don't assume as well that a person will accept an invitation for a position first time round. And because well, I've asked that person and they weren't bothered. Don't give up. We can't give up on people. Sometimes people are not at the place to be ready to leap, as it were. And so don't write off people when we're in a leadership position. Well, I've asked that person, and so they've said no, so I won't give it. And sometimes, you know, it may take a few asks to sort of get persons to engage as well. And don't overburden kind of a minority of people or anyone from a different characteristic to be experts in the fields of diversity and inclusion. And I think, as Desmond rightly said, it is everyone's responsibility with regard to that. And sometimes we can set up groups of people to be the experts in this. And, you know, what that person wants to be is that person just wants to be. They just want to be, and they don't necessarily just want to be seen as an expert on all things diversity. They just want an opportunity to actually, you know, create the design for the new school, Sunday school area or the children's area, whatever. And so be aware of the assumptions and going with an openness as well. We touched about this. Do be aware in a sense of the motivation for doing things as well. And this is just about an awareness in terms of tokenism. Are we doing this because we want to be seen to be doing the right thing, or are we genuinely doing the right thing? And is this genuinely a position that is to affect change and to help that person? So just check that out. You know, test it with somebody. You know, check it out with yourself, test it with other people as well. And just to make sure. And because be ready for a reply. I think it was Edith who says, you know, we don't want to be doing things and that person has no authority and so forth. You know, test that out when we're approaching people for diversity in leadership. But please give the opportunity. So in terms of the New Testament, we know that when Jesus said that he's going to build the church, that on the day of Pentecost in Acts 2, that they should wait for the power of the Holy Spirit to descend on them. And it was on a diverse groups of believers from Rome, from Libya, Cyrene, Arabs. It was the most diverse collection of people coming together in that area. And isn't that amazing that the birth of the church and the leadership of the church came out of diverse area with the baptism of the Holy Spirit? Incredible. And we seem to lose sight of this. We seem to forget this. We seem to sometimes get hung up on our historical areas of, you know, Pentecostal, Church of England, Methodist, Baptist, and this is our tradition. But when the actual anointing for every believer was first introduced, it was on a diverse group of people to set forth in motion the birth of the church. And that was to ensure that the church would be equipped with the power to be the witnesses across the earth. What a fantastic starting point to have. I've had the experience of being part of a church which has had, you know, diversity, and it's one of the most thrilling experiences, I have to say, my Christian experience, when Black, white, Asian, people of different colors, different backgrounds, different age groups, and we've just got this collective sense of God's presence and working together. They are beautiful moments, and I think it is the fulfillment of the New Testament. It's the opposite of Babel, isn't it? The Tower of Babel. And I just want to touch upon this, and we talked about this briefly in terms of our understanding of New Testament leadership, that everyone is a leader and has a specific function to do within their area of leadership. We tend to look at leadership as being the person on the top and the persons on the top. Oh yeah, that is part of leadership. But leadership in the New Testament, we know Christ says that the church is the body, and he used the importance of the body, and there is no privileged part of the body as the sole part of the body. That's what Paul was teaching. You know, if the eye says, well, I don't want to be part of it, you know, it's not going to work. The whole body plays a role and plays a part in actually, as it were, fulfilling the will of God. And so it's important that we recognize this diversity of leadership is established as a Christian principle in the teachings in the New Testament, and how the church was birthed in it as well. We mustn't forget as well how Christ himself demonstrated and broke down the barriers for engagement with people who were different from himself when he met with the woman of Samaria in John chapter 4. Samaritans, as far as the Jews were concerned, were very much the lowest of the low, hated. But here was Jesus, and you know, I had a little bit of a chat with Sarah in the break, and we were talking about the disadvantages that women face. And here was Jesus. He was talking to a woman, and a woman who was, you know, not a Jew, but a Samaritan who was despised. And it's very interesting how Jesus had that conversation when the rest of the disciples weren't there. take note. Sometimes you need to have conversations when certain people aren't around, because they can actually dissuade you and influence the situation and getting to the nugget of things. And it was through that conversation that actually Jesus revealed himself first to be the Messiah. And through that conversation, it led to Samaritans coming to accept Christ as the Messiah as well. And there was a great transformation. And so we see that example, but even, and notice what happened when the disciples came back. They were saying, Jesus, what are you doing talking to the Samaritan woman? They still had that mindset of like, you know, and so the diversity, but Jesus was courageous. So I think one of the things that we need to recognize, and I think this speaks to doing something, not doing it for show, you know, doing it with the intent for a purpose and a development of a clear goal of, in this case, it was the revelation of Christ. And in other cases, it would be for the development of the work of your church. And so let's not lose sight of how Jesus engaged with diversity in his time historically, not just the, as it were, the great kind of words of unity and community and so forth, but the real hard courage to actually, I am going to actually speak to someone who would be seen as an outcast, and I am going to engage with that person, as it were, to take the work forward. So what is the goal of diverse leadership? Well, I would always say that the goal of diverse leadership from a church perspective is to fulfill the will of God, first and foremost. As I mentioned earlier, it's the opposite of the Tower of Babel, when there was a collective moving away from God, in that we were saying that actually we're going to build this tower for self-glorification. Look how great we are. And that the scriptures say that God says, actually, if they put their mind to it, anything, they will do it. And so God had to intervene at the Tower of Babel in terms of disseminating them, in terms of confounding them with language. And yet we see the fulfillment, the collective in the New Testament, which we are the benefactors and the inheritors, is the pouring out of God's presence on diverse. Isn't it amazing that you know, the scriptures talk about Joel, you know, I will pour out my spirit on all flesh, not just certain tribes, not just certain groups, but on all flesh. And the reason for having that diverse leadership, it's all about fulfilling the oneness in Christ. Very interesting how I would argue that Paul's letters, his epistles and letters, are very much kind of trying to tackle the whole aspect of inclusion and diversity of the churches, and trying to manage that. You're saying, well, actually, you may do these practices, or you may be used to that, or someone else may have taken a position, and Apollos and Paul and build that, and so forth. But he was trying to reveal to them that you shouldn't allow these differences and these traditions to separate you. And how do you integrate diversity to take the, as it were, the work of the church, the gospel, forward? What does diverse leadership look like? It's always important that we get a sense of what diversity brings. As I mentioned earlier, diversity brings a high quality of improved outcomes and results when it is released in an environment of trust, in an environment of openness. And we know with the England football team how diverse they were, and they got to the final. Each one of these football players, they all know their role that they've got to do. Like, some of them got very different backgrounds, different experiences, but they understood their own roles. They understood that they worked collectively, and as a result, they was able to almost get to their prime goal, as it were, in terms of winning the the European Championships. But I'm talking about the importance of the value of diversity, that it works, and when we have the quality of wanting to be part of something bigger than ourselves. There is something very special about that, to be part of that. And you know, you listen to people who kind of look back on life and look back at something that there's a high quality that they look back is, oh, I remember being a part of this because it was something special. It was bigger than them, and there was something unique about that. And I think that is the great legacy that we can have and build as a church as well. I want to kind of briefly go back to bringing it to our own experience in the UK with regards to diversity and from a Black perspective with regards to the Windrush generation and what that meant, and how that has an effect from the African Caribbean community going forward. And now we have a lot of new emerging African communities that are really thriving, and our communities here, and just understanding their experience. I think it's important that we have a sense and a grasp of the experience of minority groups and learning from their experience. So the Windrush experience was, as we know, in 1948, after World War II, the labour shortage and the invitation from the British government to invite, as it were, their colonial subjects to come and respond to the call of the motherland. That was done, and that was an opportunity to serve and to rebuild the country. It's really important to remember that, you know, that first wave of migrants, you know, 492 that came on the Empire Windrush that docked at Tilbury Docks, you know, on the 22nd of June 1948. They came with a history, and a lot of them had a history where they had a strong sense of faith and belief in God. And that was coming from a British experience of missionary work in the Caribbean. And for some of them, it was, you know, understanding that they saw the UK as the place where they had already experienced through schools and through their experience in the Caribbean, that it was a place that they wanted to, as it were, give the best of their lives at the opportunity that was afforded to them. And we know that they didn't receive a great welcome. And there was the tension of colonialism and racism that they expect. I think I've got on my screen here, I couldn't see it before, but I mean, that was just a phrase that was kind of used, no Irish, no blacks, no dogs, as it were. But yet the generation that came over came, and I want to mention this as well, is that they came and they set up kind of the churches from their front room. They started to have fellowships. Some of them went to churches because they were coming from an Anglican tradition, and they went to Anglican churches, and they were told, well, it's nice to see you, but we wouldn't mind if you don't come again, because some of our, you know, some of our members are a little bit concerned. And you know, I know stories where people have told me about the reception that they've had as well. But they came, and if they couldn't integrate, some churches they did, some they didn't. They set up kind of churches in their own, fellowships in their own front room, sometimes in school halls and community centres. But it was that first generation that was the first to actually own their own buildings as churches within the Black community. And so they were very much pioneers. Pioneers in the sense in that they came and they they didn't just kind of accept their lot, as it were, but sought to continue to add value to the country, where faith was very much important to them. And we use the term kind of a black churches, majority black-led churches, that actually developed a sense of ownership and belonging in the community. And it's through that their leadership was developed. And many people have been able, because of the actual establishment of the black church as communities, was able to actually integrate in a more positive and confident way as well. Call it reverse missionary work now. One of the things I remember back even in the 80s, there was a thriving of these churches, the Pentecostal churches, black-led Pentecostal churches. I even remember that Church of England were actually were doing surveys in actually interviewing and asking black churches, how do you get so many young people to attend churches and so forth? There was a bit of a real boom in the 80s and early 90s with regards to the growth of churches as well. And there seems to be a bit of a decline in the white churches at the time as well. We know that some of the churches were characterized by exuberant praise, involvement of young people, as I mentioned, very much kind of committed to the Bible and traditions as well. I think now more so, I don't know what people's feelings are, is that some of the African churches are really taking shape as well now in Nottingham and across the country within that regard. So I'm saying that because I think that we have to recognize the place that we're at in terms of access as well. So I think these are probably some of the questions that we've probably already responded to. And this is just to reflect on in terms of, who is in your church from a global heritage background? And what is the local makeup and the influence of diversity of your church history? It may be interesting to find out about, does your church, it may not appear like on the surface like there is a diverse history at the moment, but does it have historically a diverse history? So I know at St. Nick's Church, it was one of the first, it has a record of a black person who was baptized at St. Nick's Church. It's recorded there. It's one of the earliest records of a black person in Nottingham at St. Nick's Church, because the record of the baptism of a black person was there as well. George Africanus, we know, at St. Mary's Church, his gravestone was found there more recently. So perhaps there may be a little bit of history you may need to do about your own kind of in church, perhaps what has been any kind of diverse heritage there. If not the church, what about your area? I'm talking about how you can make links into recognizing diversity and the influence of that. What about the area that you're in? How diverse is it? And how can you integrate your knowledge of this in developing leadership? There could be something in your area which is there's a requirement for support from diverse communities. And you could be genuine already doing something that is looking at that particular area for that particular community. These are just openings potentially that you can start to be looking at as well. I think one of the important things as well is that, and I think this is the learning process, is having conversation without hostility in terms of diversity, moving beyond guilt complex, and that's something that both sides have to deal with, black and white or whatever the diversity is, but also recognizing that everyone has a responsibility for calling out injustice in an area of discrimination, racism, and it's everyone's problem where there is no diversity, which is affecting negatively the relationships, as it were. And so this kind of a conversation, I think leadership has got to model it. I certainly remember talking to a number of people from leaders from all kind of stripes, as it were, and ethnicities on the back of George Floyd, but doing stuff like that previously as well. So the importance of being compassionate to one another. And I'm thinking about this specifically when we're talking about building diverse leadership, because sometimes, very often, no one starts off being a leader. Go back to Moses. He was just tending sheep at the time when he got his call, you know, and it is a process. And as I talked about earlier, the importance of having what we would call the courage to engage, as it were. There's a scripture I think it's in Timothy, that talks about perfect love casts out all fear. And, you know, it's through this love of God, it drives away fear. And I think that is one of the things that's going to be required more and more going forward. We are going to become increasingly diverse, not less so. We're going to be increasingly diverse. And so the challenge is to get ahead of the curve, as it were, with regards to our understanding of what that diversity will look like and how we engage from a knowledge point of view, and from an understanding of building diverse leadership as well. And as someone was saying earlier, you know, if I don't see myself, can I be there as well? So I want to talk a little bit about modeling a diverse leadership pipeline. So some questions to think about and some areas to be looking at, perhaps, and just to be reflecting on. So how can you put yourself in areas of diversity? I think we asked the question, what's been your experience of being in the minority? But reflect and think, well, actually, how am I, in what ways am I actually experiencing diversity in my own development, my own work? I've done some work, and I know with Edith, I mean, I've done some work. I remember we did some work with regards to immigration and with the Syrian resettlement. It was a vulnerable person scheme, and when we had that massive influx of, I wouldn't say it was massive, but when we had an influx of refugees from Syria, and the work, and I think the church was very pivotal in that, embracing and welcoming, and for me that was a new experience. And I always remember, even though I remember it was triggered by the death of the young boy Alan Kurdi, I think his name was, and the wave of emotion and support, I always remember, and then you know, like a lot of people kind of responded to that. But for me, what I remembered, what triggered that, is when I was actually in a room with people from Syria. I always remember this, and it was a big table in London, and they invited people who were actually Syrian refugees. And in the break, I had the chance to speak to a lady from Syria, and she was telling me how she had lost her uncle, and she was telling me some more details about what had happened to her. And it was really strange, because although I had been involved in doing some local work and supporting it, it wasn't until I had actually engaged in that it really made sense to me. And so I think look for opportunities for where you can be experiencing and embracing diversity, and where to check that out. So that could be checking out your neighborhood, it could be checking out networks. I talked about knowing your flock, because we're talking about the potential here of developing a diverse leadership. How can you talent spot? How can you spot those who are probably hiding their gift? And then how is it that as leaders, how are you creating opportunities for service and for giving an opportunity to serve? You know, I always remember my mentor, Reverend Canon Weaver, saying, "Oh, Clive, look, you know, we've got this young group starting up. I want you to go in and get involved and help out with it." You know, how are we actually creating opportunities and giving opportunities? You know, that phrase, equality of opportunity. Someone mentioned this as well about, and this is vital, and it kind of gets lost sometimes, but mentoring and training is so important. We can't just, you know, expect people to be, you know, chucked in, thrown in, given these opportunities, and there isn't the kind of a support around them as well. And then when it doesn't happen, we say, well, we've tried and it doesn't happen. So I think creating not only the opportunities, but looking at, well, what's the investment that's actually being provided to actually develop people and to mentor people, and to have a long view about this, so it eliminates what can be perceived to be seen as tokenistic. And tokenism, I really believe, is to do with motivation, but have a long view. You know, take a long view, and what is the vision for your ministry and your church and your influence. And you know, an important thing I would say as well in terms of that leadership pipeline development is always value the value of the person. You know, that will come through in the end. You know, the value that you have for those who you are trying to model and develop into leadership. Creating a culture of diversity and inclusion. So might as well just start where you're at. What needs to change in your area? You know, start small. Start early. Do it now. Expose people to a culture of diversity. Where is it that your church is identifying with diversity? Start with senior leadership as well. How can you be exemplars and championing diversity? You know, who are you connecting with? How are people seeing that diversity being reflected in you as a leader, that they could point to in your ministry, and the power of being intergenerational as well. I think when sometimes we talk about diversity, there's also diversity in terms of youth and age as well. It's really important. And again, this is about building the trust and confidence, so that everyone feels, as it were, safe to engage or to have an experience and opportunity. Networking is very powerful. Some of you, I'm sure, are very familiar with the majority Black-led churches. I'm part of that core group as well. Dr. Ezekiel Alawali from God's Vineyard Church is leading that as well, and has been very instrumental in engaging, again, on the back of George Floyd, engaging with different organizations and public authorities with regards to what is happening with regards to the response to the majority Black-led churches in this sphere. And so there are opportunities for networking and meeting, and I've met with some people as a result of the majority Black-led churches' work to address certain issues, but also help to bring on other people with their development as well, with regards to understanding leadership. And again, that can be seen as an area of leadership in addressing the issues and taking things forward. So I want to kind of conclude with a few things here around diversity, inclusion, and the church, with some kind of reminders really for us. Is that the church is called to be the salt of the earth and the light of the world. And we have to see that with regards to what that means with regards to diversity and inclusion. and how that is reflected through our leadership. The salt of the earth and the light of the world in that area is so powerful, and the church needs to be representing that. I would encourage to develop a genuine participation and support equality of opportunity. Have a fresh look at that. How can you be, as I talk about spotting and bringing people on, encouraging people on, who can be mentored? Who can you develop as mentors? The church is to be seen as the beacon for change, which is just and transformative for the better. As I was saying earlier, our city, our nation, where we're at the moment, is becoming increasingly diverse. I think we're still awaiting the Sana census report. It's highly likely that it will be over 40% with regards to the Black and Asian minority ethnic makeup, certainly in the city. With regards to diversity and inclusion, can we create a culture where you are accepted? And that is going to develop the kind of a pipeline for diversity of leadership. And we shouldn't lose sight as Christian believers that in the book of Revelation, it gives a picture. I think it's in Revelation 7, all nations from every tribe. Notice that every tribe was worshiping God together, you know. So I think sometimes we can get overhung up on our differences, you know. We're all made in God's image, and Revelation talks about that. Those images that we're different with, we will still be worshiping God with in the fight in the finality, as it were, of the end of the age, as it were. And I just got to say, with this work, and I think I said this at the beginning, it's about being persistent with this, having a long view and being persistent. We don't have to wait now for the next tragedy to sort of before we start, you know, delving deeper in this, as it were. I know people are making steps, they're taking sacrifices, taking action, but I would encourage you to be persistent in this, because the benefits far outweigh the kind of a negatives of this. So to be courageous, to be persistent, and to be reflective of the type of ministry and church that God is calling you to. So those would be my reflections. Let's take us out of that here. And I would just want to invite any thoughts or questions or observations or any comments that anyone wants to make before we kind of hand back over to our colleagues. Marsha.
Well, I thought it was really good. So I've been making notes, some really good things there that you brought to the table, and just ways of like how we can create a diverse culture, modeling diverse leadership pipeline. I thought was really good, and I mean, I've made quite a few notes, but I'm also thinking, how do we get this heard to more people? Like, more leaders in the church need to hear this stuff and engage with this, because we talked about in our group when we went into the breakout rooms that the racism is systemic, and how do you tackle it at that level? It's great that we're all here and taking this in, but oh my God, it's far beyond here, isn't it? And how do we educate those that are in positions of power that are open to bringing diversity into leadership? Because that's where we're going to see some of the structural discrimination broken down when there is more, diverse leadership or inclusion. So that's my question. How do we, encourage other leaders across the board to engage? I think we should send Clive to all of the Church of England in the diocese to do this. Is that a big ask? Perhaps. But hey, that's my thoughts and comments.
So a number of things that I heard and sort of struck to me, this guilt complex. I think, Lydia, you said that in South Africa, you felt ashamed, I think you might have used the word. And others have said things like that. And I'm thinking, this is not the way it should be. You should not feel ashamed of yourself. This guilt complex, in the Bible, it talks about this, the children shall no longer suffer for the sins of their parents. So it means to me that you don't have to feel guilty about what happened in the past, but what you should be responsible for is your actions now. And you speak truth to power. And you pray for that strength to be able to do that, because it is not easy. There's this boulder coming down the hill and there's look at you, I've used that metaphor before. So you speak truth to power when you can. To me, the image that Clive gives of Revelation 7:9 of all nations worshiping God, that is the end story. So the church is here right now, writing the narrative of what that story will look like. Now, are we going to be blocks in the road of God's plan? Are we going to help that plan to fulfillment? So I think our job as the church, black and white, is to work with the narrative of God's plan to have the Revelation 7:9 come to reality.
Thank you, Denzel. Is there anyone else who want to share any reflections or thoughts? So, and that says I can send over this presentation later to you as well, those of you who wish to have it.
My own reflection will be that this continue to open up conversations. I know it's difficult, but on both sides, really. I was just saying, like last week, we had a powerful one, and I was happy that there's bits of it that seem to have been, almost practical, a response. And then I was also waiting, because the lecture last week was like, it doesn't have to always be the Black person responding, that's everybody. When you keep quiet, it's almost like being complicit too. So getting a response from some other person that is also of white was beautiful to see that it doesn't have to be only on our shoulders. So like today, what we've had, how do we make sure that there's a practical response to them? So open those conversations, and compassion from both sides. Let's not stifle it, because if it's not spoken, then it will be there. It doesn't matter how uncomfortable on either side, but just
I second that, Edith. I think that we've got to, in however ways we can, encourage our white brothers and sisters to speak up, because the group that we've got at St. Nick's, We Are One, that's been very powerful, having our white brothers and sisters stand with us and be very vocal about their journey, about their experiences. It's just been healing and powerful for those of us that receive that. So that's really important.
So I think what I'm learning as well is that I think Denzel talked about it. We are telling a story, and there's a narrative. And I think even what you just said there, Marsha, about what's happening at St. Nick's and the response, how is that being shared beyond your walls?
Well, we had a.
I'm not asking you to sort of tell us, but if you want to, you can. But you know what I mean. I'm not, you know.
Well, one example is we had an open discussion on a Sunday at the 10:45 service, and it was, I think, one of the key things is to keep creating spaces for conversation, for people to hear the experiences of racism, and also to learn, and also to ask questions and just begin to have conversation. It's so important. So that's how it goes. That's one of the reasons. At the last PCC away day, which was 2 weeks ago, they have adopted the anti-racism policy that we've created for the church. Yay!
Amen. Well done.
Yeah. So they're just a couple of ways of how it's going beyond just a group of people in the church sort of beating the drum about racial injustice.
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, I've been very honoured to sort of share with you this evening, and I count it a real joy to sort of be with you this evening, and what little I have been given to share with you. There's a book here of it's called How I Got Over, and it's a collection of testimonies of people from the Pilgrim Church, and their story of their experience of coming to Christ and being in this country. And they're very short, but they're all real people who tell their story of what it means to be a Christian and why church was important to them. And even my own mother said, I'm just flicking through it, she passed away, she's in here, she gives her own testimony as well. And a mixture of people. But I just say that to say that sometimes the damage is done because we don't capture our history, and we don't learn from it, and we don't have a point where we can go back and learn from it as well. So I think there is a richness in sharing, and through that sharing we become closer. I think it was Dr. King who was saying, like, I don't know you because you don't talk to me, and you don't talk to me, I don't know you, and because I don't know you, I don't just, and it just leads to one thing after the other. You know. And so these small encounters of engagement and openness, you know, can be sometimes a means of whereby we can start to make change. But thank you very much, everyone. And I'd like to, at this point, hand back over to Edith and Sarah. Thank you.
Thank you, Clive.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah.
Bless
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you, everyone, for coming. And Sarah, if you have anything else to add, otherwise we'll say the grace and call it a night. It's been a very full one. Yeah. Oh, I don't know if Sarah is still here. Otherwise, let's say the grace and just go.
So the grace
To our
Our Lord Jesus Christ,
and the love of God, and the fellowship
of the Holy Spirit,
be with us all evermore.
evermore.
Amen.
Amen. Amen. Amen.
Right, everyone.